They assumed I'd get nothing. My aunt actually said those exact words to my cousin in the hallway outside my grandmother's hospital room 3 days before she died, not realizing I was standing close enough to hear every syllable. "Don't worry about her showing up so much. She's not getting anything. Mama already told me years ago." I stood there holding a cup of ice chips I just fetched for my grandmother, and I didn't say a word. I just walked back into that room and sat down beside her bed because I hadn't been showing up for a payout in the first place. And 3 weeks later, a single handwritten note proved exactly how wrong my aunt had been. My name is Destiny. I was 28 years old the year my grandmother Alina passed away, working as a special education teacher and living in a small apartment that barely fit my furniture, let alone the life my Aunt Vivian seemed to think I was angling for. Aunt Vivian was my mother's younger sister, a woman who'd built a successful real estate career and never let a family gathering pass without some quiet reminder of exactly how successful she'd become. Her daughter, my cousin Renata, had followed a similar path into corporate law. And between the two of them, family conversations tended to orbit around closings and depositions and property values, subjects that made my job feel small by comparison, at least in the way they talked about it. So I wasn't close to Aunt Vivian, not really, and I wasn't particularly close to Renata either. But I was close to my grandmother Alina in a way that felt entirely separate from whatever hierarchy the rest of the family had quietly built around money and achievement. Grandma Alina had raised 4 children as a widow after my grandfather died young, working as a seamstress out of her home for nearly 30 years, taking in alterations and custom orders from half the neighborhood, building a small but steady clientele through nothing but skill and word of mouth. She never had much, but what she had, she managed carefully. And by the time I came along, she owned her modest house outright and had quietly built a savings account nobody in the family seemed to know the actual size of. Every Thursday evening, for as long as I could remember, I drove to her house after my classes ended, and we sat in her sewing room while she worked on whatever project had come in that week. And I told her about my students, about the small victories that mattered so much in special education, moments other people might overlook entirely, but that felt enormous to me. She listened like every word actually mattered, and she never once suggested my career was somehow less impressive than Vivian's or Renata's, never once made me feel like my life needed to look a certain way to be considered a success. When Grandma Alina was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, the prognosis grim from nearly the very beginning, everything about how my family behaved around her began to shift in ways I found increasingly difficult to watch. Aunt Vivian visited more frequently after the diagnosis, but her visits carried a strange, transactional undertone, questions about the house, about whether Grandma had updated her paperwork recently, about whether she'd considered simplifying things by signing certain assets over early to avoid complications later. Renata visited even less, sending elaborate flower arrangements instead, the kind that looked expensive but required no actual presents to send. I became the one who managed nearly everything else. I drove Grandma to her chemotherapy appointments on the days my teaching schedule allowed, and on the days it didn't, I used personal time I couldn't really afford to lose. I learned her medication schedule down to the exact hour, learned which foods she could tolerate after treatment and which ones made the nausea unbearable, sat with her through the long, difficult hours when the chemotherapy left her too weak to do much besides rest, and talk quietly about whatever came to mind. "You're the one who's actually here, Destiny," she told me one evening about 4 months into her treatment, her voice thinner than it used to be, but her eyes still holding that same warmth I'd known my entire life. Vivian asks about the house. Renata sends flowers, but you just sit here with me every single week, exhausted from teaching, and you still show up like it's the easiest thing in the world. I told her that was because those Thursday evenings had become the steadiest part of my entire week, long before she ever got sick, and she squeezed my hand, her grip weaker than it used to be, and told me something I didn't fully understand until much later. I've been thinking about fairness a lot lately. Not the kind that splits things evenly between everyone regardless of what they've actually given. The kind that sees people clearly for who they've truly been. I didn't press her further on what she meant, assuming she was simply being reflective the way people sometimes get during a long illness. And I let the comment settle without asking the questions I now wish I'd asked while she still could have answered them. 3 days before she passed, I overheard Aunt Vivian's comment in that hospital hallway, the assumption stated so casually, so certain of itself that I'd get nothing, that Grandma had apparently told her this years earlier, whether that was actually true or simply something Vivian had convinced herself of over time. I didn't confront her about it. I didn't have the energy, and honestly, I didn't need her validation to know why I was actually there. Grandma Aliner passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning, in the hospital, with me sitting beside her holding her hand. Having stayed the previous night because something in me sensed the end was closer than the doctors were officially saying yet. As I called my mother from the hospital hallway, my voice breaking apart with every word, and within an hour the rest of the family had gathered, the particular energy of collective grief mixing uncomfortably with something else underneath it that I couldn't quite name yet, though I would understand it fully soon enough. The funeral was arranged for the following week at a modest church Grandma had attended for over 4 decades. Filled with former clients whose clothes she'd altered for weddings and funerals and everything in between, neighbors who'd known her for most of their lives. People whose genuine grief felt like a stark contrast to whatever restlessness I sensed simmering beneath my own family's more composed exterior. I arrived early, wanting a few quiet minutes before the crowd showed up, and found Aunt Vivian and Renata already there near the casket, their conversation quiet but occasionally punctuated by glances toward the guest book, toward the crowd gathering outside, calculations I couldn't quite name but could feel happening around me nonetheless. The service itself was moving, filled with tributes to Grandma's skill, her generosity, the way she'd once altered an entire wedding party's dresses for free when the bride's family fell on hard times right before the ceremony. A story I hadn't heard before that moment. Another piece of her I was only now discovering after it was too late to thank her for it properly. My mother gave a eulogy about family closeness that felt, to me, slightly disconnected from the reality I'd witnessed over the past several months, though I understood watching her that her grief was genuine even if her presence during Grandma's illness had been less consistent than mine. After the burial, everyone gathered at my mother's house for the repast, and the mood in that living room felt less like mourning and more like a room full of people waiting for an announcement they'd already convinced themselves they knew the outcome of. A lawyer named Mr. Faraday arrived about an hour in, carrying a briefcase, and I watched Aunt Vivian's posture shift the moment he walked through the door, a subtle but unmistakable straightening, the look of someone confirming an expectation rather than facing an unknown. "Destiny," Aunt Vivian said, finding me near the kitchen doorway, her tone carrying a strange, almost sympathetic edge that felt worse than outright dismissiveness would have. "You don't need to stay for this part if you don't want to. I know it can feel awkward being here for the will reading when you already know it's really not going to involve much for you specifically. I stared at her for a long moment, understanding fully now that the comment I'd overheard in that hospital hallway hadn't been an isolated thought, but a settled belief she'd apparently held for years, casually confident enough to voice it directly to my face without hesitation. I think I'll stay anyway, I said quietly. I'd like to be here regardless of what's in it. Of course, she said, in a tone that suggested she found my presence more sentimental than necessary, and she walked back toward the living room without waiting for further response. As if you've ever had someone assume they already knew your worth before the truth had even had a chance to speak for itself. Stay with me, because what happened next in that living room is worth every second of what you're about to hear. I walked into the living room and took a seat near the back, watching the rest of the family settle into the good chairs near the front. Vivian and Renata exchanging a small, satisfied glance that I understood immediately. A confirmation between them of something they'd apparently discussed privately many times before this exact moment. Before I begin, Mr. Faraday said, settling into the armchair that had clearly been Grandma's favorite, worn soft in the shape of a woman who'd sat there every evening for decades with her sewing in her lap. I need to explain that Alina left specific instructions regarding today's proceedings. Instructions that include a handwritten note she wrote roughly a year ago, which she asked to be read aloud before any discussion of the formal will begins. As a ripple of unease moved through the room, Aunt Vivian's confident posture flickered slightly. Renata glanced toward her mother, uncertain. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from a plain envelope, the handwriting on it visibly careful despite some unsteadiness, the kind that comes from a hand that had spent decades guiding a needle through fabric with precision, now working against the early effects of an illness that hadn't yet stolen her clarity entirely. To my family, Mr. Faraday read, his voice steady. If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and I want to say some things plainly, because I've spent a great deal of my life being quiet about things that needed to be said clearly. He paused, glancing around the room. I've raised this family carefully, and I've watched each of you closely over the years, closer, I suspect, than some of you realize. I want to be honest about what I've observed because I think honesty is the only real gift I have left to leave any of you. As Aunt Vivian's hand had gone still on her lap, nobody moved. Vivian, the letter continued, using my aunt's name directly, I want you to know I've heard more than once over the years comments made about what you assumed I intended for this family after I'm gone. I want you to understand that assumptions made confidently without actually asking me directly are not the same as knowledge. And I'm addressing this now so there can be no confusion about what I actually decided in my own words on my own terms. As Aunt Vivian's face had gone pale, her eyes darting briefly toward me before returning to the letter in Mr. Faraday's hands. Renata, the letter went on, you sent beautiful flowers throughout my illness, and I want you to know I appreciated the gesture, even as I noticed, gently, that flowers cannot sit beside a hospital bed or hold a hand during a difficult treatment the way presents can. Renata said nothing, her expression uncertain. There is one person who sat with me through nearly every single chemotherapy appointment, who learned my medication schedule without ever being asked to, who talked to me about her students and her life like those conversations actually mattered, rather than treating our time together as an obligation to be managed around a busier schedule, Mr. Faraday read, his voice softening. Only one person who never once in all these months asked me a single question about the house or my savings. He looked up from the letter and his eyes found mine across the room. That person is my granddaughter, Destiny." The room fell into a silence so complete it felt physical. Aunt Vivian's mouth had opened slightly, her earlier confidence completely drained from her expression. Renata stared at the letter like she was trying to reconcile it with something she'd believed for years. Mr. Faraday continued reading. "I know it has been assumed, casually and confidently, that Destiny would receive little to nothing from my estate. I want to address that assumption directly because I think it says something important about how easily people can decide someone's worth without ever actually checking whether that assumption reflects reality." As I felt tears building behind my eyes, my hands pressed together tightly in my lap. Destiny showed up for me consistently, without expectation, without asking for anything in return during the hardest months of my life. That kind of presence is worth more than any amount of money could ever measure, and I refuse to let it go unacknowledged simply because acknowledging it plainly might make certain family members uncomfortable. Aunt Vivian's expression had shifted from shock into something closer to visible shame, her eyes fixed on the floor now, unable to meet mine. "For that reason," Mr. Faraday read, slowing his voice to give proper weight to each word, "I am leaving the house on Larchmont Avenue, along with the majority of my savings, totaling approximately $540,000 to my granddaughter, Destiny." The number settled over that room like something physical, something everyone in it could feel pressing against their chest. "To my daughter Vivian and my granddaughter Renata, I leave $40,000 each, along with my sincere hope that this handwritten note encourages some honest reflection on the cost of assuming you already know someone's future without ever asking them, or the person in question directly." Mr. Faraday folded the letter and set it gently on the coffee table in front of him. "This can't be right," Aunt Vivian finally said, her voice unsteady, noticeably less forceful than the confident dismissiveness she'd shown me just an hour earlier. She wasn't well toward the end. Her judgment might not have been what it used to be. "Elena wrote this note a full year before her diagnosis was even confirmed," Mr. Faraday replied calmly. "It predates her illness entirely. There's no question of impaired judgment here. This was written by a woman in complete control of her own decisions years in advance." Aunt Vivian had no response to that, her earlier certainty completely dissolved. "I heard you," I said quietly, and it was the first thing I'd said aloud since the letter began. My voice shook, but I kept talking anyway. "3 days before she died, in the hospital hallway, you told Renata not to worry about me showing up so much because I wasn't getting anything anyway." The room's attention shifted entirely toward Aunt Vivian, who sat frozen, her face pale, offering no denial. "I wasn't showing up for this," I continued, feeling something inside me finally settle after weeks of carrying that overheard comment quietly without confrontation. "I want you to understand that clearly. I would have shown up exactly the same way even if this letter had said nothing at all. But I want you to sit with the fact that you were confident enough in your assumption to say it out loud, to your own daughter, 3 days before she died, without ever once actually asking me, or apparently ever actually asking her, what she truly intended." Nobody argued the will's no contest clause when Mr. Faraday mentioned it moments later. The handwritten note itself had already done more convincing than any legal explanation could have managed, laying bare in Grandma's own careful script, exactly what she'd witnessed, and exactly how confidently wrong certain assumptions in that room had been. I left that house that evening and drove straight to Grandma Aliner's place on Larchmont Avenue, sitting in her sewing room in her old chair, surrounded by half-finished projects she'd never get to complete, and I let myself cry properly for the first time since she'd died. Not because of the money, because I missed her plainly and completely, the particular kind of missing that leaves a hole shaped exactly like the person who's gone. A few days later, going through her things, I found a small wooden box tucked in her closet, and inside it, alongside old photographs, a stack of fabric swatches she'd apparently saved from every major project of her career, each one labeled carefully in her precise handwriting. Near the bottom, I found a folded note dated the same day as the letter Mr. Faraday had read, a private message meant only for me. Destiny, it read. I wrote the formal letter for the family to hear, but I wanted to say this part just to you. You never once made me feel like an obligation. You made me feel like a person worth knowing right up until the very end. I hope you never let anyone make you feel small for loving people simply because you can without needing anything back. That's not naivety. That's the rarest kind of strength there is. As I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time holding that note against my chest, understanding fully now just how clearly she'd seen everything, long before any of us fully understood what she'd been quietly planning. In the weeks that followed, my relationship with Aunt Vivian remained distant, though not entirely severed. She never apologized directly for the hospital hallway comment, though she did eventually send a message acknowledging that she'd underestimated both my role in Grandma's life and the actual clarity of Grandma's own intentions. Renata reached out more genuinely, admitting she'd absorbed her mother's assumptions without ever questioning them herself, an honest acknowledgement I appreciated more than I expected to. As I kept the house on Larchmont Avenue, moved into it eventually, and kept the sewing room exactly as Grandma had left it, occasionally taking on small alteration projects myself, using the skills she'd taught me almost accidentally over years of watching her work while I talked about my day. Some evenings I still sit in that sewing room, and I think about how strange it is that it took a handwritten note, written a full year before anyone knew she was sick, to finally settle an assumption that had apparently been circulating quietly through my family for years without my knowledge. People sometimes ask if I feel guilty about the inheritance, about the tension it created with Aunt Vivian specifically. I've turned that question over many nights since, sitting in that quiet sewing room after the sun goes down, and the answer I keep arriving at is always the same. I didn't create the assumption that I'd get nothing. My aunt did, quietly over years, confident enough in her own certainty that she said it out loud without ever once checking whether it was actually true. The note didn't create that truth. It simply revealed what had been true all along, in Grandma's own careful handwriting, undeniable and permanent, exactly the way she'd intended it to be. My grandmother spent her final months mostly surrounded by people confidently assuming they already understood her intentions, and one granddaughter who simply showed up because Thursday evenings had become sacred to her, long before anyone thought to make assumptions about what that presence might eventually be worth. In the end, she made absolutely certain the truth would be spoken plainly, in a room full of people who could no longer pretend they hadn't heard it. So I'll leave you with the same question I still think about often. If someone confidently assumed you'd get nothing, certain enough in that belief to say it out loud without ever actually checking whether it was true, would you have stayed silent the way I did, trusting the truth would eventually speak for itself? Or would knowing what they truly believed about your worth, spoken so casually behind your back, have changed the way you showed up in those final days, even knowing it wouldn't have changed anything about why you were really there in the first place.